Welcome to our deep dive, everyone. This time, we're taking a journey through a really pivotal period in British history, how their government changed from 1600 to 1900. We're talking huge shifts here, like going from kings having all the power to a system where parliament and democracy, well, at least started to emerge.
Yeah, it's a fascinating era. I mean, they basically ripped up the rule book and rewrote it, and we're still seeing the impact of those changes today.
Okay, so let's rewind back to 1600. Paint us a picture. What's life like in England back then?
Well, imagine a world where you're basically stuck in the lane you were born into.
Yep.
Nobility, gentry, commoners, that's your destiny, and there's not a lot of wiggle room. And at the top of this very rigid ladder, the monarch, total absolute authority.
And we're not talking about a queen waving from a balcony, right? This is real power.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. They controlled pretty much everything. Courts, the economy, going to war, all decided by the monarch. Taxes, yep, they set those too.
Yeah.
And don't even think about questioning their religious views. They were seen as practically appointed by God, like untouchable.
It's kind of hard to wrap your head around that level of power in one person's hands. What were people thinking back then that made this system last for so long?
It all boils down to this idea of the divine right of kings. It was like a deeply held belief that went unquestioned for centuries. Challenging the king, forget treason, it was seen as an attack on God's plan.
But even with this powerful king, there were these little seeds of change, right? Parliament existed even back then, although maybe not as we know it. What was their role?
You could say Parliament, even in those early days, was like this other voice separate from the king. Now, they didn't have a ton of power, but their very existence, it suggested that maybe things could be different. You had the House of Lords, the nobles and church bigwigs, and the House of Commons, the elected guys.
Okay, so two power centers, the king and parliament. Sounds like a recipe for conflict. Was that just bound to happen?
It kind of was, yeah. As Parliament started feeling its oats and wanting more, the sparks began to fly with the king. And that all explodes with the English Civil War in 1642. It's like, okay, this idea the all-powerful king is going to get put to the test.
We always hear about the English Civil War as this epic battle. What were the real issues that pushed it over the edge?
It's complicated, like a tangled mess of religion, politics, and money. King Charles I, he's pushing his authority hard, fighting with the Puritans, and trying to raise cash without Parliament's okay. Was a recipe for disaster.
And then, of course, there's that whole thing where Charles tries to arrest members of Parliament. That's got to be a turning point.
Oh, yeah, no, going back after that. People saw that as a direct attack on Parliament. Like, okay, this king's not playing fair. It was a major rallying cry for Parliament and its supporters.
So the gloves are off, and England's thrown into this brutal war. What happens in the end?
After years of fighting, Parliament comes out on top. They actually execute Charles I in 1649. Can you imagine? I mean, that sends shockwaves through Europe, right? Kings are supposed to be untouchable. Suddenly, it's clear even they have limits.
Executing the king. Talk about a radical move.
Absolutely a game changer. It shattered this idea that kings were invincible. And that opens the door to this wild experiment, the interregnum.
And England's basically without a king at this point, right? What kind of government do they come up with?
Buckle up. It's a bumpy ride. Parliament takes over, and they're trying all sorts of different things. Eventually, Oliver Cromwell, the military leader, he becomes Lord Protector. It wasn't exactly smooth sailing, though.
Right. Cromwell's in charge now, but I'm guessing it wasn't a walk in the park. Were there problems getting this new system off the ground?
Oh, yeah, big time. The interregnum, it's just full of turmoil. Politics are all over the place. Religious disagreements are flaring up. And Cromwell, well, he's got his work cut out for him, trying to keep things together.
So, years of trying new things, lots of drama. Did they ever figure out a lasting solution during the interregnum?
It was more like a crash course in what not to do when you don't have a king. I mean, they learned some things, sure, but it was clear this system wasn't built to last. In 1660, they bring back the monarchy with Charles II.
The monarchy's back, but I bet they weren't going back to the old ways of doing things. What's different about the king's role now?
They couldn't just erase what had happened. Parliament had tasted power, and they weren't giving it up. So the king's back, but this time it's a constitutional monarchy. That means his power is limited by, well, a constitution and Parliament.
Okay, so it feels like a big turning point, right? Moving away from kings ruling by divine right to a system where power is more spread out.
Definitely a key moment, but don't think it happened overnight. It was a slow process, lots of back and forth between the monarchy and Parliament. And then, of course, there's the Glorious Revolution of 1688, which really throws a wrench in the works.
The Glorious Revolution, another one of those huge events. What made it so important?
Well, basically, they kick out King James II, who was Catholic, and replace him with his Protestant daughter Mary and her husband William. But here's the big thing. It makes it crystal clear that Parliament gets to choose the monarch. The king is no longer calling all the shots.
So we see this gradual shift, the monarchy losing ground, Parliament gaining more and more power. What allowed Parliament to pull that off?
Well, a few things. Ruling during the interregnum gave them a sense of, hey, we can do this. The Glorious Revolution just reinforced that idea. But maybe the biggest factor is that people started seeing Parliament as representing them, not just the king and the elites.
It's amazing how this dynamic flipped, from kings who could basically do whatever they wanted to a system where Parliament's holding the reins. That sets the stage for some big changes in how Britain's run, right?
Totally. This power shift, it's the foundation for a more democratic system, where the people, through their elected officials, actually have a say. But that's a whole other chapter of the story. So we've seen how Parliament really flexed its muscles and became a major player in British government. But there's another side to this story, right? It's about who gets to call the shots. Who has a voice in how things are run?
Exactly. It's not just about having a parliament. It's about who gets to choose those people. And let's be real, back in the early 1600s, it wasn't exactly a big open party.
Oh, no, not at all. The right to vote, what they called the franchise, it was limited to a tiny sliver of the population. Like, you had to be a man, first of all, and on top of that, you had to own a decent amount of property. So most people, women, working class folks, anyone without land, they were basically left out in the cold.
So even though it might look kind of democratic on paper, it's really just the elite few calling the shots. How did that start to change?
Well, the 1800s, that's when things really get shaken up in Britain. The Industrial Revolution, new ideas about individual rights and democracy, reform movements popping up everywhere. All of that's pushing for a system that's a little more fair, a little more inclusive.
Right, and that's where we hear about those reform acts they always talk about. Can you break those down for us? What were they and how did they change things?
The Reform Acts, they were a series of laws passed throughout the 19th century, and each one chipped away at the unfairness of the voting system. But let me tell you, every step of the way, there was pushback from the people who liked things just the way they were.
So they had to fight for every inch of progress. The Reform Act of 1832, that's often seen as a really big deal. What exactly did it do?
It was huge, no doubt, but even then, voting rights were still pretty limited. He got rid of those so-called rotten boroughs, these areas where hardly anyone lived, but they still got to send people to Parliament, usually controlled by some rich guy. And they shifted some seats around to better represent the cities that were booming because of industry.
So some changes to make the system a bit more level. Did it actually get more people voting?
Yeah, definitely. The 1832 Act loosened up the rules about who could vote based on property. That meant middle-class folks, shopkeepers, professionals. They finally had a say.
Wow, that's got to be a big deal, bringing a whole new group of people into the political game. Was that the end of the reform movement, though?
Nah, the fight wasn't over. The goal was a truly democratic system, and they weren't there yet. The Reform Acts of 1867 and 1884, they kept pushing things forward, giving more working-class men the right to vote. Like the 1867 Acts, it gave a lot of skilled laborers in the cities the vote. And then the 1884 Act, it went even further. Even agricultural workers out in the countryside got the franchise.
So step by step, more people get included. But it's still just men, right? When do women finally get a voice?
That's a whole story in itself,
Yeah.
The women's suffrage movement, they fought tooth and nail for their rights. It wasn't until 1918, with the Representation of the People Act, that some women over 30 and meeting certain property requirements could finally vote.
A long time coming, and even then it wasn't full equality. What were the arguments against women voting anyway? It's crazy to think about that now.
And it all boiled down to these old-fashioned ideas about women's place in society. They said women were too emotional to be trusted with political decisions. Their job was at home, not in Parliament. They even said giving women the vote would turn the world upside down.
Wow, it's hard to believe people actually thought that way. How did the suffragettes fight back against these ridiculous ideas?
They did it all. Peaceful protests, petitions, but also more extreme stuff like hunger strikes and even damaging property to get attention. They called out all those stereotypes about women. They said, hey, we're citizens too. We deserve the same rights as men.
It took incredible guts and determination to make a dent in that system, and they did it in the face of some pretty harsh opposition. That just shows you the power of people standing up for what they believe in, even when it seems impossible.
No doubt about it. The fight for women's suffrage, it's a reminder that the fight for equality is never easy. But if you're persistent, if you're willing to challenge the status quo, you can change the world.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about voting rights, who gets to participate, but the whole political landscape was changing in other ways, too. The Industrial Revolution that started in the late 1700s and just kept rolling through the 1800s, it turned British society upside down. How did all this new technology and economic change affect the government?
It's like a domino effect.
Yeah.
The Industrial Revolution, it changed how things were made, sure, but it also changed where people lived, how they lived. You had cities growing like crazy, this huge new working class, and a whole bunch of new problems. Poverty, overcrowding, pollution. It's like, okay, government, time to step up.
It sounds like the government was scrambling to keep up with all this change. How did they handle it?
It was a mixed bag, really. They did try to fix some of the problems, like those factory acts. They put limits on child labor and made factories a little safer. But there was a lot of resistance to change, especially from the folks who were doing just fine under the old system.
And in the middle of all this chaos, new political voices start making themselves heard. The Labor Party, for example, they come onto the scene in the early 1900s. What was their role in all this?
The Labor Party, that was a game changer. They were born out of the labor movement. They were there to speak for the working class, the people who had been ignored for so long. They were all about workers' rights, social programs, making things a little more equal.
So the Industrial Revolution, it wasn't just about machines and factories. It shook up the whole political scene. New parties emerge, new issues are on the table, and the government's got to deal with this whole new world.
Absolutely. The 1800s, they were a whirlwind of change. Britain's government had to adapt, sometimes kicking and screaming, sometimes taking the lead, more people voting, new political parties, demands for social justice. It all shows how society changes and politics has to change with it.
Wow, we've covered a ton of ground today,
Yeah.
from those all-powerful kings to Parliament taking charge and more people getting the right to vote. It's pretty mind-blowing how much Britain's government changed between 1600 and 1900.
It just shows you that governments, they're not set in stone. They change and adapt over time. Like all those social and economic forces, new ideas, they all play a role in shaping how things are run. Britain's story is a perfect example of that, this constant push and pull between holding on to tradition and embracing change.
One thing that really stands out to me is this constant struggle for power. The king versus parliament, the fight for voting rights, even those new political parties popping up, everyone's vying for control.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. Power's never just handed over. It's a constant battle and negotiation. And this whole period in Britain, it's like a front row seat to how power shifts, who gets to wield it, and how they use it.
We started way back with a king who could pretty much do whatever he wanted, this whole idea of the divine right of
Yeah.
kings. But then, piece by piece, that power gets challenged, chipped away, redistributed.
The English Civil War, that was a real turning point. Not only did it put the king in his place, but it showed that the people, through Parliament, they could actually exercise power and make a difference.
And it wasn't just about who sat on the throne, it was about real changes in people's lives, right? More people voting, reforms because of the Industrial Revolution, new political parties. It's all connected to that power shift.
Absolutely. The expansion of the franchise, even though it was a slow process and met with plenty of resistance, it brought more and more people into the fold. Those reform acts in the 1800s, they weren't perfect, but they were a big step toward a more democratic system.
The Industrial Revolution, that really threw a wrench in the works, didn't it? It created all these new problems, changed the economy, forced the government to rethink everything.
Oh yeah, the Industrial Revolution was a real game changer. Cities exploding in size, the working class emerging as this powerful force, and all these new challenges like poverty and working conditions.
Right.
It forced the government to step up and deal with these issues. In a lot of ways, it laid the foundation for the kind of social safety net we have today.
And that's where we see new political ideas and parties coming into play, right? Like the Labor Party, they were all about fighting for the working class.
Exactly. The Labor Party, they represent this growing awareness of class differences and the need for a system that actually works for the people who have been left behind.
So by 1900, Britain's government looked nothing like it did back in 1600. They'd gone from a king calling all the shots to a constitutional monarchy with Parliament running the show.
And it had become a lot more inclusive, with more people having a say in how they were governed. But it was also a system that was still a work in progress, still figuring out how to deal with all the challenges of a rapidly changing world.
It's a good reminder that governments, they're not static. They're always evolving, responding to history, to the actions of people, to this constant back and forth over power, rights, and representation.
And as we look back at this incredibly transformative period in British history, it's a good time to think about what it means for us today. I mean, our political systems are being challenged too. Technology's changing everything. New movements are demanding change.
It's like history isn't just a bunch of dates and facts in a textbook. It's full of insights and lessons that can help us understand the world we live in today.
Right, if we understand how things have changed in the past, we can be more prepared to deal with the challenges of the present and the future.
Well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive into the transformation of the British government. We hope you found it insightful and maybe sparked some new questions of your own. Thanks for joining us.